Joe Rogan, I was about to call him the Podfather, but he himself says, even though a lot of folks call him that and attribute that title to him, says that it's definitely not him. Someone by the name of Adam Curry that literally created the term podcast, him and his team, along with the RSS dissemination mechanism by which all podcasts are distributed. How they go from, for example, me recording this into a microphone right now, into you receiving it in your earbuds almost immediately after being broadcast. There's him. There's folks that started podcasting about a year to 2 years tops before Rogan. Rogan's been podcasting for about 11 years now. And that's folks like Mark Maron, which started his podcast about a year before Rogan's. Adam Carolla as well, around 6 months to a year before Rogan. So folks like that, he says, are the real podfathers, but still, Joe's obviously a behemoth in this space, especially after this. Joe Rogan inked a deal with Spotify to have his podcast exclusively on Spotify, and the deal's worth over $100+ million. Or should I say that Spotify inked a deal with Joe Rogan to allow them to exclusively house his podcast on their platform. A little bit more on that a bit later. Now, here's what we know about the deal so far. Joe announced it himself on his Instagram as a message to his followers, and, he tweeted it out himself as well on his Twitter, obviously, right? And my initial knee-jerk reaction was, fuck. Because I was like, Rogan is Mr. Independent. He's Mr. Free-form podcast. He's known for turning away hundreds of thousands of dollars from advertisers that he doesn't want to put on his show because he only wants to fuck with sponsors and products that he believes in and uses and supports. And that in and of itself, set that standard for a lot of podcasters. It helps set an integrity standard that thousands of podcasts follow. Of course, you'll still see podcasts with, or listen to podcasts with, sponsors like Burger King and McDonald's and stuff like that. But that's definitely not the standard within the space, which I think would have gone differently if leaders within the space like Rogan and Carolla and others would have went that very commercial route from the jump. But anyway, so he's known for being the type of host and the type of person, the type of podcast that is going to do what they want to do their way without any outside interference. So hearing that he's signing a deal with Spotify, my knee-jerk reaction was, oh, fuck. What's going to change? What's going to be different? Why is he even doing this? Then I started looking into the deal a bit, with all the public information on the deal that's out there. And my fears of the show not existing in the form that I've come to love from all these years of listening, going back now at least 8 or 9 years for myself, that quickly subsided. Then I started to see the deal for the dope chess move that it is on both parts, both on Rogan's part and Spotify's part. So this is the way it breaks down. It's reported as $100+ million deal up front for a 3-year licensing deal of Rogan's podcast. According to Rogan, absolutely nothing is changing with the way the podcast is done. He's still doing it the same way with the same people, meaning pretty much Jamie, which is the producer of the podcast. Jamie Vernon, shout out to him. Funny ass memes and quotes and shit online about that. They say, Jamie's going to be rolling up to the podcast soon in a custom gold-plated Ferrari or some shit. Because, he's definitely getting broken off lovely. But yeah, he's going to be continuing to do the show the exact same way, which has been the case from the episodes that have been released since this was reported. The way it's going to work is that as of September 1st, the 11 years of the back catalog of the show will move over to Spotify and be available on Spotify, which was not the case before, interestingly enough. And I wonder if that was a calculated decision from, years ago. Because my podcast, for example, you can get on Spotify. The Spun Today Podcast is available on Spotify. I'm not holding out on Spotify. You know what I mean? Very, very, very tiny fish. But I wonder if that was a strategic move by Joe's part, with the foresight of getting them to come to the table or something. I don't know. That's just me speculating. But anyway, so as of September 1st, the 11 years of the back catalog of the Joe Rogan Experience podcast will be available on Spotify. all existing shows up until that point will also be available on other streaming services like iTunes and Stitcher and everywhere else you get your podcast, as it is now. Then as of January, all new content will be exclusively on Spotify, meaning all new episodes of the Joe Rogan Experience podcast will exclusively be available on Spotify and not on any of the other apps. It's no longer going to be on Apple, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, etc., etc., etc. Now I'm going to tell you guys where the two major differences come in from my perspective. From a user perspective, it being on Spotify, not a big deal. Instead of using the Apple's app on my phone, I'll click on the Spotify app on my phone. And you listen to the podcast the same exact way as always. Completely free for anybody that wants to listen. Now, I would put a small asterisk on that because Spotify, the way Spotify works is that when you listen to a show on Spotify, a podcast on Spotify, or music on Spotify, you get ads in between every once in a while, right? Unless you pay the $10 a month, I believe it is, for the premium Spotify version, then you listen to anything and everything that you want, commercial free. Even with that, I don't think it's a big difference because Rogan has like 5 to 6 minutes worth of ads in front of every single episode of the podcast now, which in the Spotify model, I would imagine is not going to be the same. Like he's not going to have 6 minutes worth of his own personal ads that he's going to be generating income off of, then plus Spotify ads. You know what I mean? Like that wouldn't make sense from Spotify's perspective. So that difference that I wanted to highlight, not a big deal from my perspective. Now the second one is more of a big deal, but where I see it's also more of where I see the chess move being played, if you will, from both sides, Rogan's and Spotify's, which is that the podcast interviews are no longer going to be available on YouTube. Now, I'm not sure if that counts for the 11 years worth of backlog interviews that have always been available on YouTube, but they're either all going away, all those full interview videos, or the new content is not going to be available on YouTube, but the 11 years of back catalog will be. But Spotify is going to start a video portion of their podcast just based on Rogan's show. So you can still definitely see the videos of the interviews, but it's going to be exclusive also on Spotify. Which, I mean, I have to see what the functionality is like when it gets created because it's still something that doesn't exist. Which, by the way, just shows what a huge investment Spotify is making, not just in the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, but the podcast space in general. It's a testament to that because they're opting to create an alternative to YouTube, which is ubiquitous within the video space. So hopefully the functionality is as seamless and easy to use as YouTube is. I would imagine, embedded within their own app, it would be. I wonder what the online browser version is going to look like because I do like watching some of the interviews. The vast majority of shows that I listen to, the vast majority of all podcasts that everybody listens to, it's just the audio version, like through apps. So for most folks, this isn't even going to matter. But because I do listen to or like watching rather some of the interviews, it's something that I'm definitely going to be paying attention for. Now, I do know that even when the show, in terms of video, goes exclusively on Spotify, Rogan's still going to keep his clips channel on YouTube, where he puts out clips of episodes, similar to how he always has, and how other podcasts do it, including myself. How I clip up episodes of portions of this show and put it on YouTube, as well as the full length audio, because that serves as like content for the more casual fan or somebody that just happens to stumble on the video. They might not necessarily have the hour, 2 or 3 to invest in listening to like your whole shit. But if you put up a 5, 10, 15, 20-minute clip of a segment of your show, it kind of serves as like a commercial for your show and also just more content. So that's going to continue to be on YouTube. And that's also where I think we can see that that this deal has been in the works for a while. Because I'm sure it's not the first time that Spotify and other platforms have approached Rogan to try to get some sort of exclusivity deal. He's by far the biggest player in the space. But I would say about 5, maybe 6 months ago, he switched his show from being completely live, streamed and unedited. So like when a guest went on his show, whomever it was live, always on YouTube. From Bernie Sanders, Elon Musk, you name it, every single episode for 11 years has been live streamed on YouTube. If you watch the live stream, then you rewatch on YouTube again, it's the same exact unedited show. Listen to the audio, same exact unedited show, all three ways. Then about 5 to 6 months ago, he switched to pre-recording the show, not streaming it live, because while it was still unedited, it was because there were so many other YouTube channels that were taking the live content as it came out and creating those clips that I was just speaking of. Then by the time he went around to do the clips on his own clips channel, there were already viral clips of an episode that he just live streamed that had hundreds of thousands of hits on them already. So he switched to that just to have the exclusivity of those clips. And I wonder now how much that had to do with the Spotify deal and knowing that he was going to retain that like clips channel. And he obviously wanted to build that up exclusively as much as possible. But this is so dope from a podcast genre perspective. And I'm really excited that a deal this big is even happening. So to get back to it, it's a 3-year licensing deal, which means Rogan owns still 100% of the IP, the intellectual property of the show. He's in essence leasing out the show to Spotify to allow them to disseminate it on their platform and generate ad revenue from it in exchange for the $100+ million deal. So for 3 years. Now, some folks in the know, in a conversation that I was listening to, or not in the know, let me rephrase that. Some folks that are within the business, not just in the podcast game, but that have radio shows with iHeartMedia, for example, and are EPs on television shows, etc. I'm referring to like Charlamagne the God. He, Andrew Schulz, Brendan Schaub, he stated that 100+ million, if he had to guess, the way, you know, deals are currently like being structured and, you know, knowing what Rogan's numbers are, which I'll get into in a second, he's saying that it's probably 125 to 150 million upfront, and that he's sure that there's some back end money as well that will add up to another 100 to 150 million on the back end as well. So if true, this is potentially a $300 million deal. Not that 100 million is anything to sneeze at. I mean, that in and of itself is like such a huge deal. But the fact that it could be potentially double that is insane. And the way that he mapped it out was referring back to like Howard Stern's deal with Sirius Satellite and how there are bumps in contracts that you sign within this space. And for example, Howard Stern had the type of deal where if folks purchased a Howard Stern Sirius Satellite subscription, and it was because of Howard Stern, and the way companies like this track that is, you know, the same way like podcast advertising works. You know, you have like promo code Rogan or promo code Joe Rogan or JRE or whatever when you sign up to Spotify. Or rather, that would be, you know, the way Spotify could track something like this. Depending on the number of folks that subscribe for Sirius Satellite for the Howard Stern show, he made bonus points on the back end, meaning more money on the back end. And Charlamagne was explaining that most likely, you know, Rogan has that type of back end deal with Spotify as well, which is just even more insane. And the dopest part of it to me is that, you know, it's a 3-year licensing deal. If after 3 years he didn't like it, it didn't go well, he'll just continue doing what he always was doing before. Lease is over, give the car back, get another one. You know what I mean? That type of thing. Or if it goes well, both parties are happy, re-up the deal, bump up the numbers even more, sign another 3-year lease, you know, do something else. Who knows? Sky's the limit at this point. And for folks that may not know, and I always have like not a hard time, but it's like weird to try to explain how big Rogan's podcast is. Like, it's literally the biggest platform on the planet. And I'm not speaking just in the podcast space. And like knowing this and believing this is also what kind of put me at ease with the whole, like, my initial knee-jerk reaction thought of, oh fuck, he's going to Spotify, shit's going to change, you know, is he selling out, quote unquote, you know, what's going on. This type of shit is what puts me at ease. Rogan's podcast is widely known, non-disputed, to have at least 190 million downloads per month. Let that one sink in for a second. And for perspective, let me give you the numbers of Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC. Primetime numbers. which according to an article from Statista, is measured by being 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. Fox News, CNN, MSNBC are always battling it out for that first place spot in terms of ratings, in terms of watch time. This article puts Fox at the top of the heap in April 2020 with 3.68 million primetime viewers in that month. They say the average total viewership for Fox within a given week is 3.54 million. So let's say 3.5 million. Matter of fact, let's say it's 4 million per week on an average week. Times that by 4 to get you a monthly number. So say 16 million for Fox News. Rogan's podcast, again, is getting 190 million downloads per month. Like, if you just look at his YouTube numbers, which is for any podcast, especially Rogan's, but for any podcast, including mine, a fraction of the views of the downloads that you get versus the audio version. His videos get millions of views. So I say that just to say that that number equates to what folks estimate, and by folks, I'm referring to Forbes articles, Washington Post articles, Wall Street Journal articles, and people, prior to this, speculating on how much money Rogan makes from his podcast. He was making $30 million a year off his podcast alone. Add to that his multi-million-dollar deal with the UFC, because he's also the top commentator for the UFC, who the UFC has wanted him to do every single show that they do, every single pay-per-view that they do, and he used to. And he actually, when his contract renegotiations came up, he said he's either going to stop doing it altogether or scale it back to only do pay-per-views that take place within the US, so he doesn't have to travel as much. And of course, they granted him that because, again, he is the best commentator that the UFC has. Then add to that his investments in companies like On It, the supplement company, which is killing it, has sponsorships with many athletes within the UFC, for example, and other sports as well. His stand-up comedy, which he tours and sells out everywhere he goes. Multiple shows per week, every week. Stand-up comedy special deals with Netflix, for example, which he has, I think, 4 or 5 on Netflix alone. And where his quote-unquote big money came from back in the day deals with the show that he hosted, Fear Factor, which is a syndicated show, as well as the sitcom he was on, News Radio, which is also another syndicated show, etc., etc., etc. So I just say all that to say that him getting paid $100 million plus from Spotify, me knowing all those details, make me say, okay, he's not doing this for the money. He's not doing, well, I'm not going to say he's not doing it for the money because I'm sure that was a big deciding factor there. But what I mean to say is that he's not going to all of a sudden change his show to appease Spotify for some reason with a licensing deal where they don't have the leverage to influence the way the show goes. Now, let me tell you what most folks speculate why he did the video portion of the deal with Spotify, which I actually agree with. For a long time, he's had I don't want to say beef, but an issue with the way YouTube and its algorithms work in terms of censorship, which, anybody that puts on anything up on YouTube would know, including myself, that whenever you have, let's say, a song or something that you might be discussing and you play a clip of, once it's on YouTube, it gets flagged almost immediately and demonetized. And for somebody like me now, with small half a dozen listeners that I have, it doesn't matter much, right? Now, if and when the podcast blows up, and I do have to, my channel is monetized and I have to go back and all those channels, all those episodes that have been demonetized because of like a clip that I played or some music that I played in the background, I'm going to have to go back and re-edit those episodes to bleep out the music or mute out the music in order to be able to get paid from those episodes. But from someone that's getting millions of hits on videos, for that episode or video to be demonetized matters obviously way more. It's also whenever you speak on touchy subjects, and YouTube has gotten kind of authoritarian and very, very, very left-leaning to the point of kind of infringing on freedom of speech, but doing it in a spotty way that's not consistent. And you have some other egregious shit on YouTube. But if somebody happens to call, even if it's by mistake, Caitlyn Jenner a he, they're flagged, then it's considered hate speech. It's weird. So seeing that and being that YouTube is the only video game in town, the fact that Spotify is taking this chance on building this video version of their platform, leveraging Joe Rogan's audience to do so, I think is a dope chess move on their part. Siempre y cuando Rogan's not going to have like Spotify's version of video censorship on their platform. You know what I mean? Because if that happens, then it's a bad move on Rogan's part, but still a good move on Spotify's part in terms of like the whole censorship thing. Another reason why I think it's dope from Spotify's perspective, from a business perspective, is that Apple currently makes up 60% of the market share of podcatchers, meaning 60% of all podcasts that are listened to via Apple Podcasts. Spotify is clearly making a play within the podcast space. Has been for a while. They signed like Bill Simmons sports podcast to an exclusive deal as well. They're creating this whole video platform, and it's dope. It's good on them. Seeing that from them is encouraging because I believed in podcasts for such a long time. Since I first stumbled upon Joe Rogan's podcast, actually, which I probably wouldn't be doing this podcast if it wasn't for Rogan's. I don't want to say I wouldn't be writing because I feel that I always had like that writing within me. I was writing on my own, before finding podcasts, but I wasn't doing it to the level that I'm doing it at now until after I found Rogan's podcast and listened to some of the dope conversations he had with folks on there, including writers. Listened to some of the writers like Graham Hancock, for example, who I then reached out to naively, and he actually responded to me via email and gave me writing advice. Folks like Daniele Bolelli, who I reached out to as well and also gave me advice. Book recommendations like The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield that I found out about and heard of because of Rogan's podcast that completely set me on a path of, okay, this is actually practically doable. Stephen King's on writing, and then just finding that podcast space, being roped into it, and then exploring out to find other podcasts. And then I was like, wait, I'm into writing and I'm into podcasts. Maybe there's a podcast on writing. And then I found Joanna Penn's podcast, The Creative Pen, which is just a treasure trove of practical information on nuts to bolts. If you want to write, if you want to put your work out there, here's how to do it. And I've been podcasting myself for 6 years now. And I was listening to Rogan's podcast for 3-4 years before that even. I still remember the very first episode that I heard. It was like in the 100 and somethings, 140 something, 130 something, 170 something, like somewhere around there. Now there's over 1,400 shows. First episode I ever listened to was with Ari Shaffir, and I was roped in immediately. So yeah, a deal like this is really encouraging. It's really raises the bar of potentiality for all podcasters everywhere, big and small. And I hope it's a source of inspiration for my fellow podcasters out there. I know it definitely is for me. And the last point that I want to touch on from a Spotify business perspective, before I play for you guys Joe Rogan's announcement, which is quick. It's like 10-15 seconds long, just so if you guys haven't heard it, I'll play it for you guys so you can listen to it. Then I'll probably be flagged on YouTube, but whatever. I just want to point out that from Spotify's perspective, since this announcement broke, their stock price over the past week has gone up over 15%, which translates into more than a 3 billion, billion uptick for Spotify shareholders. So it's an amazing deal on Rogan's part, and even more amazing deal on Spotify's part. And I'm eager to see and to follow and to continue being part of the trajectory of podcasts, because I honestly feel that we've just scratched the surface. Podcasts are going to become so much more ubiquitous than they are now. I think the number is like 50 to 70% of people even know have heard the term podcast before, or I don't even think maybe it's that high. I think it's like 30 to 50%. I forget what the exact number is, but that's going to continue growing. The seriousness that podcasts are going to be looked upon with is going to increase the respect of folks that put out quality work, because there's a lot of shit out there, including maybe even my podcast. Some folks might look at it as shit, and you're obviously entitled to that opinion, but go fuck yourself. You're definitely going to have now a more of a commercial wave of podcasts, I feel. And you even see it within corporations. Like, I'm not going to mention specifics, but I remember about 3 years ago doing a write-up at work that I wound up actually not sending out because the company wound up being sold to another company and yada yada. But speaking to, how the company should have a podcast component to it. And companies like Bloomberg, have already been doing this for a few years. And there's a demand within the finance space for finance-based podcasts. And like The Motley Fool has its own podcast, which is dope, that I recommend and listen to. Bloomberg, like I said, has a few different ones. And then the Fortune 500 company that wound up buying us, or the company that I worked for, they, about I want to say 6 months to a year after that point in time when I did that podcast write-up, they started their own podcast. And you see it in places like HBO, for example. Like if any of you guys watch Insecure, which is a dope season going on right now. I'm definitely going to speak about it when the season is over. I like the show. I think it's dope. Shout out to Issa Rae. But if you see even within the traditional, quote unquote, I guess you can call them media, cable media, like HBO, like the Insecure show has its own official Insecure podcast, the Insecure T podcast. And you have a lot of unofficial podcast shows, right? Like there's probably dozens of podcasts just about the show Insecure that are out there. But now there's an official component to it, and it's plastered right there. Like when you watch HBO, like on HBO Go or something like that, you can click on to watch the show. You can click on to watch the recap of the show. You can click on to watch the sneak peek of the upcoming show. You can also now click on to watch or listen to the Insecure T, aka the Insecure podcast. And we're going to see much more of that type of shit going on. Watch. Tip of the iceberg, folks. All right, and with that, let me hop off of Rogan and Spotify's nuts for a second and play for you guys the announcement clip of the Joe Rogan Experience podcast change.
Hello, everybody. I have an announcement. The podcast is moving to Spotify. I signed a multi-year licensing agreement with Spotify that will start on September 1st. Starting on September 1st, the entire JRE library will be available on Spotify as well as all the other platforms. Then somewhere around the end of the year, it will become exclusive to Spotify, including the video version of the podcast. It will be the exact same show. I am not going to be an employee of Spotify. We're going to be working with the same crew doing the exact same show. The only difference will be it will now be available on the largest audio platform in the world. Nothing else will change. It will be free. It will be free to you. You just have to go to Spotify to get it. We're very excited to begin this new chapter of the JRE, and I hope you're there when we cross over. Thanks.